having a civil discourse this evening. So, I want everybody to remember we're neighbors. We don't have to be friends. So,
Question. Richard, question. Is
Yeah.
there a time limit on the, how long you can speak for?
well, I'm going to go like this if I want you to pick it up. And really, what is happening after this evening meeting is that we are having yet another meeting. So, in the interest of being concise, being brief, being considerate of your neighbors. Now, that doesn't mean if you have valuable, important things to say that we don't want to hear them. But if you stand up and you see that somebody who just was up said just what you wanted to say, I was going to say that, I endorse fully what they said. If that would help. If any of you had your comments in writing, always a smart thing to do in a public hearing. Hello, Audrey. How are you? Good. Dave, I didn't see everybody come in. Why don't we just call this meeting to order? All right, let the public hearing begin. Who's on first? Excuse me, everyone. 2 sign-up sheets? One for speaker. One's for speaker and one's for...
Just general attendance.
Oh, nice.
Richard.
Paul, did you know that you got put on the list for first?
Richard.
Yes.
Say what your date is, please.
Okay, today's date is February 27th, 2013.
Mr. Prisoner, could you add my name? I did not sign on. I figured you would have me on the list anyway, but...
Oh, no, I didn't even think to have a list.
Whenever.
Of course. You know what? How would you like to close it? Or do you want to start it so that everybody knows what you're doing? What would you
I
like?
think I should start first.
All right, Paul, if I may, could I let Don Snyder, the representative of the owner of the property, speak first? Thank you, Paul. And really, folks, if there's anybody else who wants to change around this is not written in stone.
Do I
We can
sit?
do anything.
Can I sit or do I stand? Or...
You got a spot there. You want to be sure you get the cameras.
Well, okay.
I wish we had more accommodation.
All right. Actually, this is all right because from what I learned this afternoon at 12 o'clock, the die is cast in terms of this board's opinions and decisions. And I realized that who I had to talk to and explain things to was folks that have come here tonight to express their own opinions and interests. I would note for the record that I've made a number of appearances at both the Historic Review Board's meetings, October, a December public hearing, and a second public hearing in January. At the 2 public hearings, though I was told by the chairman that I would be allowed to make my full presentation when I actually showed up there, I was directed to basically summarize what I wanted to say or had submitted in my prospectus and response for information, and then summarily cut off when I was about a third of the way through my first point. So I would beseech the chairman tonight. I have taken him without knowing. I took him at his advice, and I've worked up 4 large typed pages of a guide for the points I'd like to make tonight, and I hope the chairman will indulge me and let me get through the 4 pages.
I will say, Don, that the 40 minutes that you had at the last and only public hearing was a good amount of time.
Okay. There are 4 parts to what I want to say here tonight. First is due process versus the Star Chamber proceedings and the Pete sophistry of this Historical Review Board. The second part is rumors, lies, and political personal vilification. And the third part is the HRB's fear-mongering, NIMBY paranoia versus permitted development. And the first concluding part will be the education of the villages, and this is a quote from Sullivan Smith, villages good and responsible citizens. That said, Sullivan Smith in the Saugerties Times, 2/7/2013, said, "We are here now because of a quirk in our law." My response to that is no, we are not here because of a quirk in the law. We are here because of this board's egregious violations of village code, New York State municipal law, the historical sophistry, misrepresentation, and lies used in its proceedings against the owner of 134 Bird Street, and propagandized to the citizens of the village through published articles, online blogs, comments, and official proceedings. And I would refer you to, if you got that big of an interest, to go and foil both my prospectus, the attachments, my responses to for requests for information, and the attachments that accompanied those submissions. The record and documentation of these charges is substantiated in the submissions made by the applicant and open to the public's access through Freedom of Information process. Myself, the owner's agent, came to the investigation of the record with no preconceived knowledge or prejudice of the case or the issues, but found and documented that the original registry was 1, flawed, prejudicial, arbitrary, and deserved to be vacated for cause, and 2, that the history of the individuals and property were willfully false, historically inaccurate, knowingly distorted to promote a radicalized, self-serving agenda of this board and certain of its members. Part 2, rumors, lies, and politics of personal vilification. From the beginning of the owner's inquiry on removing the historical registry to present, the applicant has presented his case based upon findings. Reference to the 3 hardship criteria stipulated in section 210-20 G/2 A through C. If you go into the village code and look at those call-outs, that's the 3 criteria that we came before this board prepared to document and show as qualifying us for a demolition of the building. HRB prejudices and animosities were evident from the start of the proceedings and are documented in the records, minutes, and published in online commentary. 10/17/12, Frisbee to Snyder in an email said, "Thank you for the letter. That was my initial inquiry. It is a sensitive and thoughtfully worded introduction to what I can assure you no one on the board thinks is a good idea." On 10/24 at the HRB meeting, insinuations were immediately voiced by members of the board regarding unspecified violations of laws or practices regarding his attempts to sell or develop the property. Arbitrary and unspecified arguments were started by the chairman regarding the preferred use of the property, such as a bed and breakfast or a restaurant. By 12/19 at the HRB meeting, the chairman disallows previous directions that the applicant would be allowed to make a full public presentation. Requests were made and demands were made for additional information, and that hearing concluded. On 1/23, the public hearing, again, in spite of promising the applicant a full representation, the chairman requires the applicant to summarize his positions, then summarily cuts presentation off after only the portion that I was able to cover regarded the flawed process of the original historical registry. The chair then allowed irrelevant and prejudicial speculations of the public to stand in the record without clarification of the issues and the application requirements. And I'm referring here to what the applicant has before the board and the 3 criteria of hardship. The rumors and lies. When this came out through published articles, through commentary to me after the meeting. When the fire, here's one. When the fire destroyed the building, the owner must have had a net windfall settlement and spent the money elsewhere. Well, the truth is, Mr. Wu did not obtain the ownership of 134 Bird Street until 12/30/2003. Before that time, 134 Bird Street was owned by W.H. Wang, who purchased it in 7/9/1999. And before that, the property was owned by W.H. Tsai, who was the owner of the property at the time of the fire. The truth is that Mr. Wu was a tenant and leased the building for his restaurant and bed and breakfast operations. The truth is that what little contents insurance Mr. Wu had, he spent on redoing the roof and attempted to protect the structure from further deterioration. Another rumor and lie. Mr. Wu has done nothing to restore the property. Rather, for some nefarious and unknown reasons, he's willfully and negligently allowed the building to deteriorate. The truth is that directly after the fire and prior to the 1994 Woodstock event, and lacking any support from the real owner, Mr. Wu utilized his own little insurance monies that he got from contents. If any of you know about insurance, you know that contents bring in very little. And he used his own money to both restore the roof and attempt to secure the building and prevent further deterioration. Truth is that without the support of the second owner, and after later obtaining title to the property, and that's 2003, Mr. Wu applied for and received site plan approval, building permits for additions to the building, and spent, as testified by Mr. Wade this afternoon at 12 o'clock, spent at least $100,000 in interior demolitions, engineering, and permits. Truth is that by December of 2003, when Mr. Wu took title to the property, the sleigh ride of the housing bubble was in full swing, and Mr. Wu, as along with every one of us here living in Dade County, thought that paradise had come and was going to last forever. And that went the same for property owners, service operators, financial institutions, and government entities. And another interesting thing that happened was that Mr. Wu's, when he took title to the property, the total land or the value assessment of the property, in fact, doubled. And so, along with the $100,000 that Mr. Wu had spent in terms of restoring the roof lines, attempting to rebuild and restore the building, he has paid out at this time well over $150,000 in county, village, and school taxes. And that is part of the very disturbing aspect of all the little lies and innuendos and discouraging comments that have been made about this man, who is basically a very hard-working restaurateur. He's honored within the Buddhist community, the Tibetan Buddhist community. When the Dalai Lama or the Karmapa visit the monastery in Woodstock, it's Mr. Wu that is personally asked to come up and cook for each one of those people. So the little snide comments that have come out both from the board and its individuals, that is among the things that I have shamed this board and its members for. Truth is, in spite of the significant monies and effort Mr. Wu has invested in the properties, changes in the building code, increases in construction costs, engineering costs, and difficulties obtaining financing, Mr. Wu could not generate the capital to restore the wreckage nor interest other investors or buyers. And in terms of the encumbrance that this historical registry has placed on the property. I refer again to one of our submissions, which is a letter from Win Morrison attesting to the fact that he's had a number of buyers that have looked at the property, and all of whom had turned away when they found out that it was encumbered with the historic registry. So the truth is, like every other hardworking citizen in this county since the economic collapse of 2007 and 8, increased cost of living, and an unrecognizable recovery that has benefited only big banks, big business, big government, Mr. Wu has struggled as desperately and continues to suffer along with everyone else in this room. Part 3, Historical Review Board's fear-mongering, NIMBY paranoia, and permit versus permitted development. As I noted before, I did not come into my investigation of this historical board's actions with any preconceived prejudice or knowledge of what I would find. When the record revealed the flaws of due process, the failures, frauds, misrepresentation, and lies of the board's self-serving propaganda and effete historical sophistry, rather than man up to their mistakes and admit to the legal jeopardy their misfeasance and malfeasance has exposed to the village, rather than allow the benefits of a controlled and permitted development to advance, they have chosen to double down their iniquities and attack the owners, seeking to enrage the public by public statements, published articles, and a campaign of vicious rumor, agents provocateur, exploitation of the public's sincere interest in historical preservation, and a paranoia of low-income housing or unwanted commercial development. And as an aside on this, I would say that I had a recent meeting with the mayor and the board to just get an update on the findings of a meeting that was held with members of the board, the village attorney, and a representative from the state's Historic Preservation Office, that the mayor, with somewhat of sheepish grin, looked at me as I came in the door and said, "Don, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I've got a report that you secretly carry a wire and record every one of your conversations here with governmental officials." I'm a little bit flabbergasted, but of course I offered to give him a pat down if he wanted. If he wanted a strip shirts, that was going to cost a little bit extra more. But
And I said no, by the way.
the point is that this was not the beginning of this sort of vicious little innocuous mental midgetry that's gone on behind the scenes. And it's been applied to Mr. Wu, and now I find out it's even being used to me. And our intentions have always been, we knew the board was opposed to the demolition. We knew the board would reject that application. But what we were attempting to do was to, having gotten the board's rejection, we then would have opportunity to advance an appeal before the village board, where, based on the merits of what we presented, we hope to prevail. We cannot expect to prevail. We did not know we would prevail. All we were trying to do was just to make our case before an impartial jury and have them rule up or down based on what we had said and submitted. Mr. Sullivan Smith, in the Saugerties Times, 2/7/13. I hope this becomes an occasion for more understanding of what historical preservation really means to the town and village of Saugerties. And I would emphasize his ending, and every good and conscientious citizen in them. I cannot find a more arrogant, racist, bigoted, and politically incendiary rant pouring forth from the mouth of a man the chairman calls a real loss to the board. Chairman Frisbee states, Saugerties Times, 2/21, historic designation is delaying the process long enough for a groundswell of opinion to be heard. I would remind the board and point out to the folks gathered here, the demolition application concerns two elements: the flawed original designation, which is now confirmed by the village attorney and the findings of the New York State Historic Preservation Office, and the 3 hardship criteria documented in the applicant's submissions and upon which this board is supposed to rule. Failing to prevail either in the record, or the facts, this board now attempts, and I'm referring specifically to what happened today here at 12 o'clock, where the board has expressed its intent to reinitiate the historic designation of Cloverleaf. The board now attempts to circumvent due process with appeals to public opinion and rage. Mr. Smith's hope, and this is a quote, "This becomes an occasion for more understanding of what historic preservation really means," has become a reality, though the results, I'm sure, are quite different from what he obviously expected. That Mr. Smith has resigned with petulance and lamentation, dismayed at the lack of support, blaming everyone from the village attorney, New York State Historic Preservation Office, the village clerk, code enforcement, the village board. All this admirably demonstrates the arrogance of his presumptions, the extent of his self-deceit, and the shallowness of his vision. The warnings that this applicant has expressed previously in testimony and submissions to the citizens of the village, and particularly to property owners within the historic district, or those being considered for landmark status, are not frivolous or without dire consequences. What has been inflicted with uncontrolled zealotry upon Mr. Wu and 134 Birch Street may also, if allowed to continue unrestrained, one day fall upon your properties. And when the grand muftis of this renowned historical review board walk past your abode and gazing, to quote Mr. Smith, from public highway to the grandeur of a bygone era, and anoints your home with historical fairy dust, you will come to understand the grievous consequences of that action. I suggest that those of you who wish to really understand the village code 210-20, the value that will be lost, that is lost to your property, the control gained by this unelected board, the violations that you will become subject to, the legal and civil criminal jeopardy you will come under, will all become quite manifest, and I think it will be a surprise to you. In conclusion, I would address those of you whose concerns for the future use and potential development of the property, and say sincerely, we are very much aware of the current dialogue and opinions rampant in the town regarding low-income or assisted living constructions, unwanted commercial development. I would assure you that that is not only prohibited by zoning code, rejected by the mayor. It has never been part of any design or development ideas that anybody that I know associated with this project has put forth. We look basically in terms of, I will say that there is a development team that as of yet is totally uncontracted, because we don't even know where we're going to come out of this meeting, or the intent of the board to attempt to register this property, or what the legal findings we will be advised of by the village attorney as to whether we need to even wait upon the board to proceed with an application for demolition. But we look to, if you're interested, and we've always said, if you want to know what are the development potentials of the property, you have only to look at the zoning schedule of permitted uses, and that lays out what we can do theoretically and what we can't do. further controls beyond that, that already exist and over and above any decisions made by, or involvement made by this board, are known to everybody. And they include the fact that the property is in the Gateway District, that we have to go before the zoning board, that we have to go before the planning board. There's the village board as a backup. There is the building department that has codes of construction. There is New York State or DEC because there are wetlands on the property. There is Ulster County Highway Department because we're on, and New York State because we're on 9W. There are a whole multiple layers of control for everybody in this room to participate in and express their positions and what they want or don't want, or what they think is appropriate and not appropriate. In addition to that, I've been in the county since 1997. I came as the project superintendent for the Army Corps of Engineers rebuilding the jetties down at Rondout Creek. At the time, it was the largest building project in Ulster County. I had previous to that, a marine construction company down in Miami, and when I had everybody that had marine property coming into my office, the light bulb went off, and I set up my own construction management and environmental permitting company here in Dayton. At first, I did only marine constructions. Alex Wade hired my company to do, as a matter of fact, to do the dive inspection of the lighthouse. And we gave a report back to him of the existing conditions. I associated for 7 years with North Engineering and Design Associates. Mike North was a planning board chair, I believe, here in the village. During that time with Mike North, I was commissioned to do a feasibility study of the 72 acres of property that are now the Conservancy property, and was unsolicited given an accolade by the gentleman over here who said that I was probably among the few people that had any handle on what actually happened in the development of the Twin Maples subdivision and strip mall. So before that, I had worked as 2 years out of the country in Jamaica, in Port Royal, Jamaica, where I was involved in the reconstruction of Morgan's Harbor Marina and Hotel, which is in the old pirate capital of Port Royal, and that is the national treasure of Jamaica. So I'm not unknowing of the realities of construction and permitting here in Ulster County. I have, I believe, a good and solid reputation, having worked with every engineering company in the county, from Pretorius and Conrad to Veneer and Larios to Milk Engineers. So I don't think I'm a wild card. I aggressively and stridently represent my client's best interests, but I don't think I'm known for promoting anything untoward or not allowed by code or law. With that, I would say that what we've got in terms of, it's so preliminary, but I can say that we have here John Waselic, who is an associate of North Engineers. He's the architect that designed the Buddhist monastery in KTD and Woodstock. I've approached Mike, and he's agreed in theory to join in, participate in the project. I've spoken to and have gotten an okay from Johnny Mullins to come bring them in as a contractor, the general contractor on the project. I have, let's see, Wynn Morrison. I asked Wynn Morrison if he would consult with us regarding marketing development proposals as to what he thinks is will sell and won't sell. I have an old prep school classmate of mine, a Harvard Business School graduate, that is president of the Harvard Business School. And he's providing equity counseling for me in regard to developing the monies necessary to actually construct any kind of development on the project. And so we move forward. We'll move forward as directly as the law and the village administration allows. And on the flip side, we'll hold this historical review board accountable for the frivolities of its misfeasance and the encumbrance or loss of its malfeasance. Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, that was good. We're having a civil discourse. And I have Paul and Andreessen next on the list. I left. Well, you know what? You're not going to want to miss this. How are you?
Good.
Thank you. Who you here representing?
Well, actually representing Trinity Episcopal Church.
Who?
Trinity Episcopal Church. I think, can you hear me back here? Yeah, we can. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the board and the committee for hosting this forum tonight. I'd also like to thank the members of the public. I realize the building inspector is not here, but the former building inspector is, the owner of the property, and his representatives, Don Snyder and John. So represent them as well. Nobody's on trial here as far as I'm concerned. The combined town and village comprehensive plan encourages the use of existing buildings as well as preserving all historic buildings. This includes the ones already on historic registers and those that are not. One of the goals of the comprehensive plan committee is to expand the list to incorporate all structures of historic importance or significance within the town and village of Saugerties. For any proposed demolition of any commercial structure in the state of New York must provide a survey of potential environmental hazards such as lead and asbestos and an abatement plan prior to the issuance of a demolition permit. Exempt from this provision are 1- and 2-family homes. Seeker requires any demolition and future use of the property to undergo review by the municipality and in some cases a coordinated review to ascertain the potential environmental impacts. At the very least, a concept plan should be provided to the board who is tasked with this approval ability, normally the village planning board. As a 26-year member of the Trinity Episcopal Church, which happens to be within 500 feet of the subject property, I have been asked by parishioners and clergy to provide comments at this forum tonight on behalf of the church, and that's who I'm representing here tonight. I have renovated several older buildings in my time as a contractor and builder. I've worked on many throughout my career, in some cases saving them from the impending wrecking ball. As a building official of 20 years, I have overseen the successful restoration and renovation and change of use and occupancy of many older buildings, those that had historic designations and those that did not. Most all the municipalities where this work had been done had benefited from the restoration in one way or another. It ended the blight on the community as well as created lasting places of commerce and livelihood for the residents. These buildings then become topics of discussion within the community, as you all know. Visitors live here, we have visitors here, and everybody talks about a historic building that was renovated, no matter what town you go through to. However, I am a property rights advocate, and in the end, no matter what happens here tonight, the owner of the Dragon Inn will have every right to do with his property as he is allowed under the zoning to do. However, and I appeal directly to the owner and his representatives tonight, I cannot imagine there are not at least a half a dozen options available for retrofitting and reuse of the abandoned masterpiece of architecture, workmanship, and beauty. For once it is gone, it will be a long time gone. I will leave you with this. There are two projects that come to mind, and in my opinion, were lost opportunities and a loss to their communities. One was the demolition of the post office on Broadway in Kingston over 40 years ago, and the Grand New School in Catskill, which was just several years ago. One became a fast food chain, and the other a pharmacy, neither of which will ever be on a register of any kind, let alone a historic one. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the opportunity to address the board and the public tonight. I will answer any questions, if anybody has any. Sorry Don wasn't in here.
Thank you very much.
Could you elaborate on the significance of being within 500 feet of the Trinity Church?
Well, I don't want to elaborate, I just want to shoot from the hip. But, you know, it's any historic building, which the Trinity Church is, as you know. Any development within 500 feet of a historic building must undergo a secret review.
Full secret.
Well, I don't know if it'll be, you know, long form, short form, that will be up to your village planning board to decide.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, there's a name I like. Michael Sullivan Smith.
Let's see if we can get the graphics working. This vindicates my reputation. This is,
If they can't see it, I'll move that over.
I'll move it over as soon as I get the file open.
Can you point it towards the screen because we can't see it?
Well, you did pick a bad spot to sit.
I know.
Get larger.
It's either you have to move or I have to move.
You should turn it
No,
just
no, no,
next to
it's
the
okay.
canal that you can
I know, I
see.
can move.
We've got over to the paper.
Does that help? Slide those chairs in.
I love modern technology.
Okay, I had up on the wall a nice aerial photograph that was taken by Wrolsen back in around 1950-51, which really is a good indication of the change that has taken place in the village since then. This is the latest USGS topo map of the village. So I can just go forward with it. Now it's going to go work for me, okay? The old-fashioned way. Okay, this is the USGS topo map with all of the tax lots in the village. So you get an indication of the amount of density that we have in the village. We've got a lot of expansion of property lines of development. Since the,
I can't see anything that you're talking about. Is there a reason?
You have to turn it. You have to have it.
let's let's aim it for that.
How's that?
No, because unless we get it square on, it's going to get. I can come back to that.
Sure. You know, I can wait in the other room.
Guard your eyes.
Would you like the lights down?
Can you see that?
It's kind of an anamorphic thing that you're doing here. It was better before. Just give us a little bit more of an angle. We can zoom on.
exactly square on, but yeah, we'll be a little bit truncated there. All right, I'm just going to go through these quickly because I don't want to take up a lot of time. Okay, this is the village with all the streets. This is the downtown business district, which is fully protected with all of its numbered lots under a federal designation. Local zoning designation is the South Side District. Trinity Church is where the little hand is right here, and that is Trinity Church complex, so it is a National Register site. As is the Lighthouse out here, the Kiersted House up here, and Blazell Brewery. All of these have different periods that they are registered under. The Uptown Business District is basically Victorian. Blazell Brewery is an industrial site. Lighthouse is also. And most of the South Side District, we have a lot of National Register eligible sites. The mill is one of those. This is where Cloverly is. And I'm going to put the tax map on now. Okay, so we get an idea of where that falls. Now you can see this is a 3.5 acre site. Next door to it is an 8 acre site. Next door to that is a 2 acre site. Over here, I don't know, that's many, many acres. All of these are over 2 acres. Everything else in the village is around 1/4 of an acre, 1/3 of an acre. If you look at Berkeley Heights, historically, Berkeley Heights was always open space. It was, you drove down 9W into the village and you came through views out over the Hudson River, views right up until the 1960s. You didn't have any development of growth of housing anywhere there. All of this on the north side of Saugerties is after the 1960s. These are the only sites that retain that quality as what was the estate district of Saugerties at that time. This is very important to explaining what Saugerties was. These houses were built by the industrial barons. They were the people that owned the mills. They were the people that employed everybody. After those people no longer, or found it more convenient to live near the financial center, those same people from Manhattan and Brooklyn and so on moved into their houses. So these houses became summer residences for the wealthy. So they were the people that drew in all the culture from the turn of the century. And they were responsible for all the people that developed the tourist industry and the boarding house industry. So all of these people, just in being in Saugerties, attracted people to Saugerties. Their houses were some of the best. Well, during this period of time, you have a lot of, let me say before this period of time, the local carpenters built the houses and designed the houses. After this period of time, you started to get name architects design the houses. And Cloverly is one of those. Let me go on to it, a little bit more of a close-up of, okay, this is the historic district. Now I want you to understand what Cloverly means. This whole shaded area, this dark shaded area, is one big pasture, it's a levee. You had a house over here that belonged to Toomey Barclay. He owned all of this property. He looked at the mountains right across this open space. He looked out the other open space at the river. He had a 360-degree view. I explained that in an article I wrote for the Post-Star, which is basically about what is called Uri. That was the name of Henry Barclay's ancestral home in Scotland. But that was an address. That's where things took place in the 1830s. If you had an occasion, a birth, a death, in the New York City newspapers, it was at Uri and Saugerties. So, and that's how it was termed before we had the village of Ulster, which became the village of Saugerties. So all of this this side of town is where it all began. It didn't begin on this side of town where we are today, right now. It was the other side of the bridge. This is the clove right here, dividing the section, dividing the north from the south half of this lead was a clove. You don't see it. Where the gatehouse is to Clovelly, right behind that is the clove. So that is the description. It divided basically all of that land. None of it really sold because people just kept it over as commons. It didn't sell until, when William Sheffield built his house. So that's between 1825 and 1882. Okay, here's the tax map, tax lots. You can see where it is. You can see right here that this little line right here is the top of the line. That's about the 150 foot mark. And that particular place is, let me get the next one here, the exact place where Clovelly is placed. This little notch that comes out here right around the CL is where they had to make the property line go around the extension that was probably from the 1960s when they went to kitchen. It's all the cinder block. It doesn't match the building at all. Where the little hand is here, that is the gatehouse. The carriage house is down around here. Okay, now I'm going to go on to some more interesting things for you people that don't like maps. There are some. We have to do a survey. Okay, this is the 1964 survey from some of you may remember Anton's. There was a restaurant that was well known. That was the third restaurant that went in there. But at that time, you still had the property intact. 1964, no divisions. But they did have this little motel. I think it's a 6-unit motel. Okay, and then following that, I'm going the wrong direction. Slipped on, but I didn't put it into the computer file, so I don't have you Henry Barclay's map of all of his divisions, so that's we'll have to skip that. I'm just going to go into what this looked like. Okay, now this is the 1950 aerial photograph that I was talking about. This is, you'll recognize this is 9W. This is Trinity Church right here. You see following the little hand that I have? You get this Z movement right here is basically 9W going over here to the bridge. So you can see how in 1950 this was totally open space. There wasn't any build-up in through here at all. There wasn't anything that was down over the hill. There wasn't, you could still get the view of the mountains right straight across the pasture land. That's the way that 7 generations remember this before the 3 generations we most recently have. But I doubt that you would get anybody in the most recent generation that even thinks that this could have ever existed. But this is what this house was built to stand out. It was in the middle of a space that was appreciated by artists, intellectuals. This house right here, this is the, and I know that this sounds a beat to some people, but this house right here was a 40-room boarding house. It's now the KFC hall. That house was where everybody that came to learn the technology that was first introduced to this country in the mills here in the late 1820s and early 1830s came to experience this innovative spirit that was happening in Saugerties. And this part of town retained that spirit for a good century after that. in fact, the last house to be built here, of the grand houses, was the house of Annis Deacon, whose father had, let's see, I can get it on one of the other maps, but was here for many years because he managed the lead mill in Lanieri. So, and this house right here replaced a house that was built by the people that ran the iron mill, but it ended up being the people that ran the brick yards. So they all moved into Saugerties. This is another thing I wanted to point out, and I'll go to the last 3 maps after I say this. Very few people know the name Fortis Laughlin anymore, but Fortis Laughlin was the, he basically ran the centennial operations in 1911 for the centennial of the town. That family had a mansion where the senior housing is on Main Street. They had another mansion where the post office is now on Market Street, and where the Bridge Street Medical Center is. They had another mansion there. And the whole family were the biggest benefactors to Saugerties for that whole period of time. They ran the powder mills. Before and after the Civil War, they were direct competitors with the DuPonts. They were edge large. Their operations were centered in Chicago and spread out over the United States. They were extremely wealthy people, yet they centered their homes in Saugerties. Nobody remembers them anymore. If you're paddling out on the Hudson River, you go past the Long Dock. William F. Sheffield, at the age of about 32 years old, actually he was, I think, 42 when he was the mayor of the town. Very young guy, a go-getter, and he's the guy that built Cloverleaf. He's our man. He spearheaded the building of the Long Dock just to bring tourism into Saugerties. And that still sits there waiting for the steamboats to come and drop off the tourists. This took a lot of, steady involvement in the town. He was president of the bank, of the Saugerties Savings Bank. We can't take these people, that are most important citizens and say what they did was not valuable. I'm going to do the 2 other, I had this all in one file, but it's kind of slipped up on me. Okay, now this is the Esopus pit. This is a formation. You'd have to decide, if you were looking at this for the first time, was this a crater? Did some asteroid hit here or something like that? It's all an escarpment going around the whole perimeter of it. It goes along, where you are, walking down the hill to go into the conservancy. It tracks around to where Cloverleaf is, right? It's hard to see because there's a tree in front of it, but this is Cloverleaf right here. Okay, now, and this is 1950, okay? Now look at the steep bank, and I'm going to tell you what this is because it's really hard to get. I'm going to slide over here a little bit and you can see it's the steeple for Trinity Church right here. You can see that this is a resort house right here made from another mansion. And you can see that there's a fence that goes right along the line, and this drops down. That's a ladder, or a steep staircase. And then you can see a path that goes down to the dock. That's on the pond. It's the same over here with Cloverleaf. Okay? There's a fence going along. They don't want people to fall over the bank. It's a very steep bank. And then there's a slight incline that goes down, and this is the carriage house down here. Now the carriage house, you have to, and I'm going to point out this to you also. This house was built in the age of the automobile. This house, a horse and buggy. So the carriage house is directly related to the field where the grazing could take place. But you see, even at this time, when there's no grazing taking place, there's no horses down there, there's still no vegetation growing. And it's still shrub right now. And you have to ask why. Okay, now, this gets a little bit beyond history, and I'm going to say that there's nothing in this area that isn't historic. I mean, it's aged so that it has to be taken as historic. But it's historic because they built there for a reason. They built there for the reason that there was the pond to look over and the mountains to look at and the river to see out the back door or the front door, depending on which you situated the house toward. And this whole area was open because that whole flat area on top that goes all the way down past Glasgow, all the way to Flatbush, it's all seeping out right here. This is where it comes out. Okay, so this is a DEC wetland for a reason. That's always been wet. That's where the paper mill got its fresh water in order to keep its, make clean paper. Everything's pumped in from there. There's still tiles lying around back in the upper. So this area is very fragile. It's not only fragile historically, it's very fragile ecologically. And I thank Dan Lamb for the access to these. I'm going to show you one more. I thank Morris Rosenblum for being a great... He was in surveillance during World War II. And when he arrived after the war, he just couldn't stop. Okay, a beautiful view because you can see the rim of this would-be crater. I'm not going to get into, like the speculation of on how that happened, why that is such a nice round form. But it is part of Saugerties. The reason that we had this big place to put a pond, a nice narrow place to put a dam, and tidewater to be able to have a harbor and bring in all of the, or take out all of the goods that we produce here. Saugerties has to know this, and they have to know the importance of the people that made that happen. And we're not going to, and nobody's going to ask a generation from now if they don't have something to make them curious. I'm just going to leave this up that way. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like to speak now? I believe it's, I believe you're, yeah. Can I move back so I can? Yes. Thank you. You want that?
Yeah, since he's got it.
Okay. I guess we will get in.
You what?
I may be on this file get listed.
My pictures are bigger.
Okay, good, good.
Shorten. No, not that. That would be a corporate strategy. You don't open that. Shortened, is that file? Yeah, it's a PDF. Can that work?
It's a 0 bytes.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, it's a PD.
I think that's something else. Okay, that's not just it. Let me see if I've got the one that you had sent. I can buy.
Technology.
No, that's what I was rushing out the house.
I'm sorry.
What are you pulling up on?
Careful.
I'm sure that I put it in here.
Why?
You recognize the name?
Later, I'm going to take that real quick. It's maybe important to flash to show.
Do you have time?
While you set it up, I can.
Well, we're just going to rearrange the schedule a little bit so that Scott can actually get the file that he needs.
That's the only one I have.
That's the only half. That's actually a really good structure though, because
We doing that, or?
I'll come back and I'll talk about this one while you're having it up, just because it's an interesting slide.
I can zoom in on it.
No, we'll go back to the whole thing, because I think it's fascinating. I'll come back and talk a little more about architecture, but one of the things that's interesting about the architecture of this is, this is reported that this is not significant, it's not relevant, it's not stylistically appropriate to the period, which is the biggest mystery I've ever heard in my entire life. And actually, it's very interesting to look at the stylistic differences between Wildenstein and the Calvert Box Carriage House and Saugerties at the same time. And in fact, what's interesting is that Josiah Caddy, who built the carriage house, is actually someone who started the shingle style, which is in fact incorporated by Calvert Box in the carriage house there. And stylistically, they have a very, very similar approach to architecture. And the differences in style represent a very, very consistent pattern you see throughout that period of industrial development of the Queen Anne style. And I'm going to come back because I have more slides. I apologize, but as it didn't work, I'll go pick it up.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Some fascinating stuff. Sorry about that. While he's picking his stuff up, Josefa, would you like to say?
Yeah. Is Mr. Snyder here? Because, you know, and Alex can, I mean, some of this stuff is the best of my knowledge. And you would know better, and so would Mr. Snyder. Is he here?
Yeah.
Okay. First off, I oppose the demolition, and I'm requesting a full seeker. I believe under county and state law it is required because of its proximity to a National Historic Landmark, our beautiful Trinity Church. Also because the footprint of the structure is under DEC jurisdiction, which I could talk about later. I'd also like to just add, I'd love to have the lead agency be the HRB, Historic Review Board, because they are the professionals with engineering, architectural, historical expertise. And I'd also think that it'd be nice if the owner put money in escrow to pay for a land use lawyer. This is common practice. At the informational meeting, I was disappointed that the Historic Review Board was forced to accept the owner's application for demolition without comment or challenge. The village owes everything to the Historical Review Board and the hard work they've done in revitalizing the economy of the village. Those members have the information and background needed to determine if the application is incomplete and/or unsubstantiated. Where is it in the law where it says the board has to approve an application as is, as they did in January, even if the application is incomplete, unsubstantiated, and perhaps even containing falsehoods? I believe in property rights, obviously, because I'm a property owner. I've been a next-door neighbor to Cloverly for 33 years. I think I've been a good neighbor, fair, patient. Proof of that is that I never complained about his neglect, except once, which I'll mention later. When the owner bought Cloverly, I assumed his intention was to restore Cloverly. And I figured the owner needed time. He got time, lots of time. I never dreamed that demolition by neglect could be used as an excuse to demolish Cloverly. For years, the owner or owners left windows open, doors open, and easy access to the property as if he were inviting vandalism. In the back of the house, he or someone filled in the land to extend his property, and he paved it. He needed a DEC permit to do that. Did he get the permit? That's a question. He did, apparently. I doubt he did. But again, I didn't interfere. Wooden additions were added, but later I heard a stop work order was placed on these additions because their construction was deemed unsafe. Those illegal additions, for some reason, had been allowed to remain standing all these years despite multiple code violations. Those rotting, unsafe, wooden shacks are what give the impression of a ruin. If anything should be demolished, those additions should. It's surprising that the owner himself didn't come up with the idea, especially since he's been trying to sell Cloverly for $1 million. And those shacks don't do much for curbside appeal. Sorry. Now, there was one time I did complain. I'll get back to that. A few years ago, I heard loud commotion coming from the property. I heard it for days and days, as did my husband. Finally, I went over to see what was going on. I saw trucks, dumping, stoves, refrigerators, all kinds of large appliances, plus construction debris and trash. They were dumping over the hillside behind Clove Lake. The hillside is DEC wetlands. It was growing into an enormous junkyard, covering at least an acre visible from my home. I called the village, and I'm sorry to say nothing was done. Trucks kept coming. Finally, out of frustration, I called the DEC. The owner was ordered to remove the debris, as far as I know. Not everything was removed, but covered over with dirt, and to this day, still visible. So future owners will have that to deal with. I mentioned the junkyard in illegal additions for a reason. The owner has violated building and maintenance codes, local, municipal, and state laws. This is not a rumor. As for village laws, I suggest village officials look at Law 210 to 20, which Mr. Steiner referred to, a law that has been on the books since 1987. Laws that the owner has been allowed to break. The laws the rest of us have to follow. For example, within less than 2 months of buying our property, we were told by the village that our grass was too high. And if we did not mow it, the village would come and mow it and charge us for the expense. That we were only there 2 months. We get periodic visits from the code enforcement officer, inspecting for safety and fire hazards. Nothing wrong with that. But something's wrong with the special exceptions or favors the owner of Cloverleaf has been given all these years. 2007, I attended the hearing for landmark designation. The owner was there, no objections were made. Now the owner is implying that he was somehow hoodwinked into accepting the designation, he was inexperienced. He's been owning and operating businesses in the area for over 25 years. He's not naive. He's had to apply for liquor licenses, dealt with health authorities, payroll, sales tax, etc. He understood that landmark designation is a definite plus. Grants, low-cost loans, and a lucrative pilot are available for historic restoration. Of course, landmark designation is not a plus if you want to tear down the building. In his application, now, he claims the building isn't historically important, as we've heard. And now I've heard there was a glitch. A certified letter was not sent out. For 6 years, he never objected to landmark designation. Now he's claiming the glitch, that letter, is a fatal flaw. But I say the decision for landmark designation was made. There are minutes to that meeting and witnesses, including the owner. A glitch doesn't discount the landmark designation. For the village to reward demolition by neglect is setting a very disturbing precedent. If he can demolish his building just because he wants to, then we all can. And then we lose all the progress we have made as a village. The buildings on Main and Partition Streets, they were vacant and boarded up in the 70s. What's to stop those owners from demolishing or neglecting them? Perhaps federal regulations, but there are plenty of other buildings that could be demolished and neglected. What has stopped them is the Historical Review Board. Their mission is to preserve historical Saugerties and its unique charm. It's because of the charm of Saugerties that we've begun to attract businesses that have revitalized the village. When tourists talk of Saugerties as charming, cool, unique, they obviously are not referring to gas stations, chain stores, franchises. The Gateway offers an introduction to our historic village. The town, Saugerties town, has gateway regulations that specifically refer to historic Saugerties village as a model to follow. Village officials are also responsible for keeping our village historic. History and restored historical landmarks are part of cultural tourism, and cultural tourism generates millions of dollars and is the backbone of the village's progress. Clovelly is, of course, prominent on the gateway. That is why it was designated a landmark. That is why the owner was given that economic advantage to encourage him to restore the building. He has been favored and singled out for special treatment for years, and it's still not enough for him. The irony is, if he tears down Clovelly, he does not have 3.5 acres free and clear. He's left with 1/3 of it, if that, and the rest is encumbered by DEC wetlands jurisdiction. The footprint, I talked to the DEC, the footprint of the original structure, that is, anything built before 1959 is grandfathered in by the DEC. That is, Clovelly alone, the original Clovelly, is grandfathered in. It's not encumbered. But if he wants to build something new, like 30 units, 30 parking spaces, plus natural buffers on all 4 sides of the property, I wonder if the DEC will possibly allow that. His property, those wetlands of his, flow into the Esopus Creek, a creek which is now designated by the DEC and now by the EPA, recently by the EPA, as impaired and requiring additional federal and state regulation. In other words, it is highly unlikely that property is worth much if Clovelly is actually torn down. The irony is, Clovelly, with its landmark designation, is the single most valuable asset the owner has.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Thank you very much. I appreciate all those who preceded me, giving me a historical review and so on. My husband and I own a house on Barclay lot that was purchased at an auction in 1852. We've been here for 50 years in our house. We worked very hard on it. We're about 900 feet away from Clovelly. And just a few comments before I read mine. We actually went to Anton's restaurant when we first came to live here, so I know what that was like. Another thing is when I called Morrison's, or was it Win Morrison, once about the property, I asked what the situation was, and the representative that worked with Clovelly said that every time there was an interest shown in that property, the price went up. So there again is something that tells a little bit about the owner. So it never did get, I mean, it probably could have been sold twice, maybe 3 times, if the price had remained stable. I'm also, of course, not in favor of the demolition of Clovelly. Not only because it's an irreplaceable historic building, but because it will act as a precedent, as Josepha said. No historic building in the village will be safe. My second point is a little different from all the history, wonderful history and maps and so on, is that what will replace Clovelly that will be beneficial to the village and an attractive addition to the gateway to the village. Now, the Saugerties Times and the agent for Clovelly, Mr. Snyder, has stated that after demolition, the construction of 36 units of high-end townhouses are planned for the 3 acres and not low-income subsidized housing. Now, where have we heard this storyline before? Let me enlighten you. Dickerson's Keep, planned for Route 32 in Glasgow about 3 years ago, started out to be high-end townhouses. At present, it is on the back burner of the town planning board, seeking approval of 42 units of low-income housing. Why? Is there a market in Saugerties for high-end townhouses? Perhaps not. Or is it more profitable for the developer to seek tax relief, federal, state funding, okay, and low taxation through pilot programs and 581 legislation? I think we know the answer. Definitely it is not what is most, it is what is most profitable for the developer and not in the interests of that particular piece of land, edifice, or the community. We're talking taxpayer-paid development here. Another example is Country Meadows on North Street. This project began as a 55-unit development for low-income senior housing. It has been recently approved by the Village Planning Board for 33 units of low-income housing and only 22 units of senior housing. After this development is constructed, how long will it take for all the units to become low income? I guarantee not long. My point being, can you believe a developer who says high-end units will be built on the Clovelly property? I think not. Remember, low-income housing brings very little taxes to the community, but utilizes to a high degree services and resources, police, ambulance, schools, water, sewer, that property taxpayers must subsidize. We have and already been stressed to do our share. We have almost 220 specified low-income units in the village alone. I'm not counting what's in the town, that's another 100 and some, 150 or whatever. So we have done our share. And it may sound great, high-end townhouses, but in most situations that doesn't work. All right? So I would say please save what we can, save Cloverly. It's important.
Thank you. Looking for Benno, Dina, Josepha? Yes. How are you? Thank you. Good.
Okay, Clovelly sits at the entrance to the village in a row of historic buildings, including Trinity Church, a National Historic Landmark. Because of its unique architectural design, it was rightly designated by the HRB as a historic landmark. To willfully destroy it now would therefore be illegal. The owner did not object to the designation of the property. Witnesses were present at the hearing then, and a land use lawyer who I consulted with told me there is no prescribed time limit on the notification. As to the argument that the designation does not appear on the zoning map, I can relay that a friend of mine sold 2 acres of his land and could not find the record on the Saugerties zoning map for 5 years. The so-called hardship that the owner claims of not understanding English and not being able to sell the property is totally ludicrous. He's owned several restaurants for years, and he hiked up the bank-assessed value of $250,000 to an inflated sale price of $1 million. In addition, he added illegal plywood additions that certainly didn't add a selling point. I think it would behoove the village to listen to the adjoining neighbors who would like the building saved, and not a developer who doesn't even live in the village or care about the appeal of this village, which is based on its historic buildings and the restoration of them. Thank you.
Michael Phillips. Thank you for coming.
My name is Michael Phillips. I'm the vicar of Trinity Church on Route 9W. You saw us in a photograph not that long ago. First of all, I should say what I'm not. I don't know the legal details about these sorts of deals. That's why Paul Andreessen, we asked him to represent Trinity because he's very knowledgeable about that. I'm also not a real estate developer, although I'm in favor of development of the village of Saugerties, and I think it's important for progress and increased population for the village to move forward. What I'd like to, my comments to the board and my opinion is even if legally the owner of the property was able to demolish the building and develop it under the law, is that desirable? The legal ability may not be the most desirable outcome, and that's what I want to talk about, is the desirable outcome. I believe our past is important because it reminds us of who we are, and it's linked into our identity. Saugerties is different from Catskill in part, because of the buildings that we have and the people who have lived here before us and the decisions they made and the actions they took. Saugerties is a unique place, and Clove Lee, in my opinion, is part of that uniqueness to the village. As in my current profession, I've already announced what I am. But all the major religions of the world have ancient narrative, ancient scripture, ancient documents, some dating back thousands and thousands of years, that they don't jettison because those ancient documents tell people today who they are, what is important in life, and gives them direction in how to behave, how to move forward in the world. And I think the history of Saugerties is important to all of us today for those same purposes. Mr. Sheffield and all the residents, the early residents of Barclay Heights, made Saugerties what it was and continues to inform us today in what the village is, who we are as a community. So I'm very much in favor of development, and I'm wondering if that development might occur at a different site so that Clove Lee could be preserved. Let me just say one more thing. Property owners' rights, of course, is important. But I also don't believe that every property is equal to every other property. Some properties have not just monetary value, but other kinds of value as well. And so on the person who holds title to Clove Lee owns that plot of land. But in some regard, Clove Lee belongs to all of us because of that historical place it has in our common past. In the same way, Trinity Church belongs to all of us. And an example of that is we at Trinity Church now are talking about replacing the steeple that you saw in the picture. But if you drive by a 9W, it's not there right now. We want to replace the steeple not just for us, but for the village, because that's part of what Trinity Church is and what it means. Trinity Church has been on that site since 1833, and for 180 years, people have gone by that church and known it with the steeple. So it needs to be replaced because we at Trinity Church are neighbors. We're not an isolated entity, but we we belong to you, and in some ways that you belong to us as well. So I hope that the building will be able to be preserved and brought back to its glory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a Mr. Alexander Wade.
Okay.
Would you like a chair? I can get a chair for you to sit on.
Let's sit over here.
You okay? Okay.
Josepha did just fine in this quarter, and I want to start by echoing her last statement. Chawu's most valuable asset is Dragon Inn. And unfortunately, I'm afraid he doesn't have much the rest of an asset. I've known Don Snyder for years, and was somewhat disappointed in his presentation. He had a lot of facts there, but a lot of them were sort of scrambled. And if he'd come and asked, he might have gotten some of them straightened out a little better. But that's neither here nor there. He made quite an effort to present his qualifications for building quite an elaborate development there. And the problem is that under the he also very specifically mentioned that he had to come in front of the zoning board. And this is a key element. Because under our zoning, under R3, under townhouses and row houses, he is allowed 3,000 square feet per unit. So 3,000 square feet per unit, 5,280 square feet an acre, that you don't get too many units there. So of course he's going to come to the zoning and try to claim hardship to put a lot more units there. So, but under the zoning law, hardship cannot be self-created. So if the building gets torn down, we had a perfect example here of a group that rushed in and tore a building down in the village, in the historic district, and then they discovered that they couldn't put up what they wanted to, the Boys and Girls Club. They did not read the zoning carefully. They came, they got it. I probably should have read the zoning very carefully, but I didn't have plans of what they wanted to put up at the time. So my caveat here is we should be very careful about, I'm a property rights advocate, and I certainly, a lot of Chawu's problems are self-inflicted, and I certainly was there at the meeting, and I was on that board when the designation was given, and no, he was not coerced into it. It was done for him as a favor because he said he was having trouble finding anybody that had the money to restore the building. At this time, the town was about to pass the ethical law, which allows taxes not to be raised in a slow, measured period of time if you make improvements to the building. So there's several misunderstandings here that have taken place, and I think it's very imperative that the whole process be followed very carefully, and that the village powers that be have a very, very, very full understanding of what is proposed to go in place of the Dragon Inn if a demolition permit is allowed. And by the way, I did send you a very detailed history of what happened.
And I have it, and it is a matter of the printed public record. Thank you. Is David Baker here? Please, sir.
Thank you for letting me speak.
Oh, no, thank you.
In 1924, Winston Churchill said, there is no doubt whatever about the influence of architecture upon human character and action. We make our buildings and afterwards they make us. They regulate the course of our lives. Architecture is about people as much as it is about place. When you hear people speak of 134 Birch Street in any of its past incarnations, you get a sense of how alive it once was. One of the memories I enjoyed hearing most was a recollection Mayor Murphy told me about the very first drink he ever had in his life there under that roof. Something in what he said brought the magic of that building back to me in a way no one else had. What I also got from him in our conversation was just how much he cares about Saugerties. That is the very real palpable sense I get from every single person concerned for the fate of the Clovelly. Their great pride in the unique attributes that distinguish Saugerties from the rest of the world. I've come to think of Mr. Ching-Ya Wu very differently in this regard. I believe Mr. Wu has systematically taken advantage and exploited the essential decency, the sympathies, good graces, and willingness to accommodate him over a period of many years in this village. Fundamentally ahistorical or anti-historical, Mr. Wu's partner, Mr. Snyder, at no point has shown any sensitivity to the unique architectural character that sets Saugerties apart. When he attacks the inherently decent people on the Historic Review Board with assertions that are neither accurate nor verifiable, he insults all of us and casts a shadow on the integrity of his own endeavor. Mr. Snyder should understand that the people here tonight are hard-working, conscientious homeowners who, even with very modest means, find a way to take care of their properties and the houses they live in. I say this because our simple pride in the places we live and work in stands in stark contrast to the terrible irony of Mr. Wu, who, while owning one of the most spectacular architectural treasures in Saugerties, has needlessly made it into one of the ugliest places in the village. After receiving a stop work order years ago, he left his grotesque addition standing as an architecture of spite, an architecture that says implicitly, "Screw you," to every good citizen passing by. Now we understand that if he cannot obtain an absurdly exorbitant asking price for a building he has made every effort to demolish through neglect, he will try to weasel his way into reducing it to rubble. This is as disturbing and shameful as anything Saugerties has ever known, and it is he who should be held accountable. First and foremost, I ask that Mr. Wu be made to play by the same rules every other citizen in the village of Saugerties must adhere to. The fact that he has not been forced to do so up to this point is in itself flawed, selective, and prejudicial in the worst way. The plywood hodgepodge addition tacked obscenely onto the grand original brick Clovelly must be dismantled before any other judgment can be made, either pro or con, regarding the fate of this building. At no point should we blame such an extraordinary structurally sound building for the egregious and indecent treatment it has received at the hands of its current recalcitrant owner. Mayor Murphy, you have said everyone has their opinion on the Clovelly. I understand this is true. I've spoken with you, and I believe you're an essentially fair and balanced man with a very difficult job. I must ask you respectfully, how can people form a realistic opinion on something that has had for so many years a huge, half-completed, shantytown-like structure attached to the front of it? Before you consider destroying the singular and extraordinary Clovelly, let people reconsider and form a new opinion without the awful wooden structure Mr. Wu attached to it years ago. Mr. Wu has made us live with the ugly blight he made, which has nothing whatever to do with the original, still magnificent structure he wants to rip down. To use an analogy from gardening, this is just a place that needs some weeding. Only a fool would throw away such an extraordinary flower to save the weeds. Let us see what blossoms beneath the depressing construction Mr. Wu has worn us down with. Returning to us the former grandeur of the important Saugerties landmark known as the Clovelly will bring a far-reaching, long-term ripple effect of created value in a way no short-sighted, generic, upscale, quote-unquote, townhouse complex ever will. Historical buildings can change, they can grow, they can be reused, repurposed in new and exciting and financially rewarding ways. Old buildings are one of Saugerties' greatest assets. In Saugerties, one of the very best examples we have is our lighthouse, but no less outstanding is the senior citizen housing at the Mill Apartments on East Bridge Street. Without question, the Mill Apartments are one of the great examples of old building preservation in Ulster County. Both the Lighthouse and the Mill Apartments took an extraordinary amount of far-reaching imagination and courage in order to bring them back from a degree of decline and decay far, far worse than what we see at the Cloverleaf today. Not a day goes by where our community isn't rewarded by their rescue and rehabilitation. A legal loophole must not decide the future of the Cloverleaf. I ask that an injunction be placed against the demolition of any of the original structure of the Cloverleaf until every possible avenue for redesignation as a historic landmark can be explored. Further, as is mandated by law, I ask that Mr. Wu and Mr. Snyder be held fully compliant with the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act, including a lead and asbestos report prior to the issuance of a demolition permit. It is also my understanding that a demolition permit cannot legally be issued until the community is presented with an actual building plan for the 36 upscale, quote-unquote, three-bedroom townhouses. Lastly, I ask that any action within 500 feet of the Trinity Episcopal Church National Register site be taken with the utmost respect and consideration for what is proper and lawful. Again, I will say, historic buildings are one of Saugerties' greatest assets. They are a precious inventory that must be carefully guarded. None of us live forever, but our architecture does persist beyond us. Just as both known and anonymous precursors have passed them to us, so too we pass them to our daughters and sons, and to their daughters and sons, and so on. How will generations to come remember us? Certainly not by expeditious, generic, upscale townhouses. Today and tomorrow we have the opportunity to do something far-reaching and meaningful for all those in the future who will come to know the Saugerties we care for so deeply. In 1849, 34 years before the Cloverleaf was built, John Ruskin in the Seven Lamps of Architecture wrote, "When we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for." That is how the Cloverleaf was built, and that is why we should save it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'll bring it up.
Okay, thanks a lot, appreciate that. And that will be Milford. You didn't think your chance would come.
What?
You didn't think your chance would come.
Oh, I know. I was pretty fascinated.
Okay, I would also like to state my opposition to the proposed demolition of the property in Clovelly located on Bird Street. 10 years ago, I bought my house on Valley Street. It's located in the historic district adjacent to the property in question. It's right down on the way from Trinity Church. I made my investment in my house and in the community of Saugerties in the belief that there was a sincere desire to respect and protect the culturally valuable structures of its past. Since living in this area, I have learned of the important contributions to the innovations of the Industrial Revolution that were developed within blocks of my house. It's really like the original Silicon Valley. I have discovered the priceless stained glass windows of Trinity Church designed by Burne-Jones and William Morris, the most important arts and crafts artists in the world at that time. While working to restore my own house that was built just after the Civil War, I have seen a number of historical properties in this area demolished as a result of the willful neglect of their owners. The Southside Hotel, the Ice House at Lynch's Marina. I have been very disappointed in the ability and will of the village to protect these properties. Demolition by neglect is a criminal process that has been tolerated by our community for too long. I feel that the owner's treatment of the Cloverleaf Mansion is a shameful example of this tactic to realize profit at the great expense of the heritage of our community. This building was designed and built as a testament to the success of the founders and workers of the industry of early Saugerties. Many of our community have deep roots here and would, I should think, value the landmark residences that were part of the beauty of the village where their great-grandparents grew up. This building should be designated as a historical landmark if it is not already, and the village should do all it can to to the village of Saugerties. Since it is recognized that tourism is an industry that is very important to the solvency of our village, I think that there should be a fund dedicated to the preservation and maintenance of these properties. This is our brand and our priceless heritage. The preservation of our lighthouse is well worth it. A development of townhouse properties will not enrich the community. It would be a garish view from both sides, the view from the Esopus and the gateway to our village. It will also set a precedent that will eventually destroy our historical neighborhood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle? Ah, there you are, yes. I'm sorry, I can't read your last name. What is it?
Eisenstadt.
You'll spell that for me?
Eisenstadt. Who am I spelling it for?
That lady right there. A.
Eisenstadt.
Thank you.
I came here really in the same spirit as Paul Andreessen. I think that tearing down Clovelly would be really a tragedy, and I think that there are so many possible avenues for trying to do something with this property that to try to accommodate Shawu even. What I think we need is some time to see if, what we can possibly do to look at maybe some kind of private-public partnerships or grant monies or things like that for somebody who actually does want to rehabilitate the property. I will say that I think it's a really, really important property. To me, it is the last remnant of a certain era of grandeur that was very much part of Saugerties and part of the whole Catskill area. And this is really one of our only links to that era. And I also think that it's a no-brainer how stunning this property would be in the right hands and what it would do for the village. It's just, I can picture it perfectly. It's so elegant, and, with some, well-groomed gardens and well-groomed people milling about. I mean, it's right out of an old Saugerties postcard. And, we really don't have anything else like it. So I'm kind of rambling here, but I did want to say that I walked in here feeling, we're not here to talk about people, but I'm sympathetic to the owner's situation. I'm sympathetic to the fact that it's not an easy property to deal with. I am a realtor. At one point, I actually almost had a buyer for the property. I've been interested in this property forever. It's fascinating. People who I've shown it to have found it fascinating. And, we all know that the price is out of line, okay? So that's, an important issue. But yeah, it's a difficult property to find a buyer for, and it so happens that the last couple of years have been really, really difficult for real estate in general. But it's changing. It's starting to change. This is something that requires some patience. And he's waited so long. Why now? Right when things are starting to turn around and people are really starting to think about historic properties again and money is starting to come available. Not only would it be a tragedy to take it down, but boy, it would be a tragedy to take it down now. Before it's really had a chance to, before we've really had a chance to try and find somebody to save it. And that is really the thing that I came here to discuss, is whether or not, I understand that we're not sure what the legal footing is. And, is there some way to work with Shawu, to have more time to work on this, to put together, a committee of people who are knowledgeable about foundations, about grants, and whatever, to try and find a solution that's satisfying to him, but that preserves the building. And that is basically it.
Well, that's a nice talk. Thank you. Thanks for coming up. Yeah. Now there's good news. Scott is back.
You didn't introduce him.
I didn't introduce him before because he wasn't going to speak. But now he is going to speak. It's Scott Harrison. He's the owner of the carriage house next door to Clover.
again, and, you know, I'm new here, no one really knows me, but I tend to be more, I produce a lot of volume, it's a bad habit, so I produce so many things that it wouldn't fit on the EDS that I actually own. So there will be a submission of massive amounts of data on architectural significance to the board, which I'm sure they'll be more than thrilled to be annoyed with. Sorry? That's fine. Well, you know, and I'll start by reading a statement, but one of the things I want to do is that, you know, earlier, you know, the speaker had said something specific, which is that we don't know what the structure looks like. So, you know, that's what the structure used to look like. You know, derived from as many, you know, historical pieces of information as possible. This is a beautiful structure that you can't see today because it's surrounded by a bunch of really bad construction. But in fact, the core of the structure is very, very sound. And anyone who wants to debate that, please debate it. And why don't we have an engineering report? You know what? Because you know it's very sound. That's the reason you don't have this engineering report. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I want to read a statement at the beginning. Just bear with me. I apologize. Well, just to start, you know, with, I mean, my name is Scott Harrison. I started to build the carriage house, but I graduated from Architecture and Urban Design School in Louisiana. I spent 12 years working for the largest architecture firm in the world. I've worked for architects from Frank Gehry to Paul Scheck to many places around the world. I've designed skyscrapers. I did a master plan for Boston Airport. I have a long history in the architectural community in my past, so that's the basis of this. As a homeowner in Saugerties, I was initially attracted to the region because of the natural beauty and history. With a background in architecture, I was drawn to the architectural history of the Hudson Valley, which is unlike any other place in the country. Derived the diversity of rural communities, legacy of the industrial heritage, and the opulence of the Gilded Age all come together to create this region's distinct character. Local governors should understand that this character will only grow in importance as a factor to the region's economic future. The monuments and treasures of each town and village distinguish them and help define the characters of these communities. I was attracted to this village because of this character. I found a project that inspired me to invest my time and my money. I bought the carriage house of the Sheffield estate, which, if anyone's seen it at the time, you may question my sanity. There's no real comparison with the simple state of neglect of this house compared to the carriage house. This house it needs paint. It needs some work. The idea that this is a ruin is ridiculous. And anyone who can show that to me, I would love to see it. There are problems with it, without a doubt. But the idea that this is a ruin or this is a mess, you know, is just fallacy. While the awful additions are uncared for the property and general lack of repair hide the beauty of the structure, I've seen a ruin. I have seen a ruin. I've never seen a structure beyond. I have seen a ruin. I have never seen a structure beyond repair. I have never imagined that anyone would allow a unique and important building such as this to be lost. More importantly, get down to me as a taxpayer. I invested in this community because of the character of the Berkeley Heights neighborhood. I invested in this community with an understanding that the Clovlia Mansion, its property, were historically protected. I invested because of the conservancy and the protected land. I invested in this community with an understanding that the town and village were instituting programs to incentivize historical development and preservation. With the stated purpose of conserve significant natural resources of the Esopus Creek watershed and Saugerties area, I invested in this community following the formation of the Esopus Conservancy. My time, money, sweat equity can be linked directly to the stated goals and programs instituted by the town and the village to protect the character and beauty of the place that I hope to call home. Now the neighborhood faces the loss of a landmark which, even in its neglected state, stands as a symbol of remarkable history of the community. A landmark that can one day we can be a proud example of the village's industrial heritage and long-stated goals of historical preservation. And I'm going to not read this entire thing because it will just go on and on. And I want to just because I can't show everything, I want to show a few slides just to derive a point, if you don't mind. Mike, can you
just say next?
Just say next. Just say next. I've got to hear next.
Say next. Oh.
Miracle
One of the claims that there was an unclear architectural style, and I want to just talk about the style of these buildings because this is a very important age. This age of the industrial development in America is very, very specific. We saw the industrialization of architecture. We saw sort of machines making it possible to produce the type of architecture you'd see in the cities that you really didn't get in the rural communities because you didn't have the people to build it. You couldn't bring like a massive amount of people unless you were the Vanderbilts to bring 40, 50 workmen to build windows. So this period of architecture is very representative of the peak of the industrialization of the rural communities in America, where they were all of a sudden able to benefit from the same sort of architecture that we saw everyone else. So this is really mid-19th century to early 20th century was Victorian architecture. Now, the idea that Victorian architecture is one thing, it's not one thing, right? There were many different varieties, and I'll name them. Second Empire stick, Queen Anne, Romanesque revivals, shingle, and folk architecture. It was popular throughout the period of rapid industrialization and growth of railroads, because I could build parts such as windows and doors and stuff, and I could have them shipped through railroads. So all of a sudden it was possible for these communities to build structures like this where it wasn't really possible before that. That's why the period starting in the 1850s was really the age in which you saw these mansions come up. And you notice the date early in that slide was 1852. Not 1850, 1880, excuse me. 1882 was the beginning of was the Clovelia mansion. This is early in that process, very early in the process. So, just talking about the different styles. So, because Victorian architecture is not like one thing, there are a couple of different periods, right? If you look at the period of the Victorian stick, which from 1860 to about 1890, you'll see elements of stick architecture in this design, and they're really ornamental. You see gable roof, which is not really important here, but you see decorative trusses and horizontal banding and overhanging eaves with support brackets. And there are decorative elements which carry over many different periods of Victorian architecture. Next, sorry. Then you look at, this is right out of the field guide for American houses, by the way. You look at the structures that came out about Queen Anne. You get steeply pitched roofs with irregular roofs with usually a dominant front-facing gable. You get textured shingles, asymmetrical porch, usually 1 story high. This is the picture right out of the book as the quintessential designation of what an early Queen Anne structure looks like. Look at the comparison between these structures. The idea that this is an unclear architectural style is someone who doesn't have an idea what they're talking about. This is a very pure example of a Queen Anne, an early Queen Anne. You know, when you talk about Victorian, you hear high Victorian is when it works to its peak, and at that point it dies off for the most part. This is an early example of a Queen Anne, which still has articulations of stick. It's not an unclear style. It's not a muddled style. It's actually a very pure example of this period. Next, sorry. I don't know what's next. Which is to use an example of these two buildings. I thought it was fascinating to look at the Wilderstein. And by the way, if anyone wants to go home tonight, go home and look at Wilderstein and look at the pictures before it was restored. And you tell me, you know, what could be made of that structure when literally it was a paint job and fixing some trim. This building made Clovelia look like a palace. But you can go back to that again. So, but you see the comparison between these structures. One of the things that was brought up in the presentation by the owner was his lack of consistent style. In fact, it's very common in that period. The outhouse, the carriage houses, the gate houses, the various peripheral buildings typically did have different styles. In fact, they typically had different architects. This is Calvert Vaux, of course, known for Olana and all the bridges in Central Park and all the things that we know, throughout the Hudson Valley. But he didn't design the main house either, right? It was very odd. It was very common to have different designers who did these. But there is a very distinct stylistic similarity between these two structures, between what is kind of the estate period where people came out building Queen Anne estates. Okay? And interesting to note that there is elements of picturesque in both of these, and Vaux, of course, is known for his picturesque work, and it's interesting that Caddy, the architect of the carriage house, and Vaux knew each other very well. And you can see stylistic transfers across these two, but there's no direct evidence that they work together on it. It looks better than that now. Yeah, it was a little bit of a mess. Okay, you can go on to the next one. Sorry. So, pass this one. Sorry, let's go to the next slide. So, next slide. So one of the things I'm not going to go into the myriad of pictures that I have in this thing and talk about, but if you look at, I picked this right out of the guidelines for structural engineer, periodic structural inspection of existing buildings, right out of the book. Signs of structural distress: deformation, cracks, excessive deflection, connection failure, instability, floor settlement, foundation settlement, tilt, spalling concrete. Spalling concrete is where the concrete breaks on the outside. Given this type of inspection, I challenge anyone to go look at the different parts of the building and see where they find these types of areas. In fact, go to the next slide. It is very unusual of a building of this age that has not been maintained at all in 20 years to notice that the detailed joints in the woodwork of this building are not even spaced. There are no gaps. There is no movement. They are perfectly aligned. There is no deterioration in that whatsoever. It needs a paint job, without a doubt. But the idea that this is deteriorating, I think, is fallacy. And I'll show you what deterioration looks like in a minute. But another thing is that, we look at structural movement and sagging and floor sag. The rear of this structure, this is taken from the owner who was trying to purchase it from the funeral home. This is an arch structure, which you can't even see today. But for a building of its age, there's not a crack, there's not a fault, there's not even a blemish in that structure. The idea that it's structurally unstable, I don't think is supported by anything anyone can just, by casual eye, look at. It is very unusual, in fact, for a building of this age to have chimneys that are probably, I'm going to estimate they are 50 feet tall, that are perfect. No cracks, no failures, no nothing in these structures. They are very sound. So I'm not sure where the basis of structurally unsound comes from. I see no sign of structurally unsound, with the exception of one place. Go back up. Next slide. Well, by the way, just to take a look at these chimneys, it's flabbergasting how perfect and ornate the woodwork. This is the area that in fact shows the most damage. Why does that area show the most damage? Notice what's missing. The owner failed to build the roof back. After the fire, capped this in, did not build the roof, and of course that's the one area of the building that's suffering the most decay. That should have never happened in its first point. So the idea that using that as an example of structure failure, I think is an example of how the owner is not meeting his requirement to maintain his building. Next slide, please. Let's show you what real structural damage looks like. So this is the carriage house when we took it over in the beginning. There's no structurally sound wall. There's nothing about it that's structurally good. And we were able to save this structure. And, I think it's beautiful today. I think it's beautiful today. But even a structure in the state of it as it is savable. So the idea that this building is not restorable and not savable is absurd in my opinion. And now, that's to be said, that it may not be restorable by this owner. And that's a very, accepted point. I understand the notion of property rights. I understand where the abilities of an individual owner to make these type of investments is limited. The question then becomes, is this building important enough for us to convince the owner to find a different way to restore the structure versus destroying the structure? And I believe it is. I believe it's representative of a period of development for this community that if you destroy it, you lose part of that period. I mean, you have the whole industrial growth coming through the iron ore and the mushrooms and all the different industries that came out of here. And all that growth led to a period of prosperity. All that growth that led to this town growing and building and becoming what it is, and yet the prosperity is not represented except in a few places, and Clovlia is one of them. And to destroy it is sort of destroying the end of the story. Let's write a story and tell a movie and chop off the end of it. I think it's absurd that you would want to ruin that part of the town's history. And I think I cut it off soon, so go ahead. And just as a point, there was a comment made that there are no buildings that are known by the architect of the main building, or the main mansion. Well, there's 4 of them. So just to be clear, there's a whole bunch of documentation on buildings that were either designed or created by this architect. In fact, this was represented as one of the earliest high-rise structures using steel in the United States. Sadly, is gone now.
I'm sorry, these are buildings by Sheffield?
No. By the architect.
I'm sorry, by the architect.
And what you'll notice, and this is the Mark Twain house. In fact, you'll notice a lot of stylistic similarities between that house and the Clovlia mansion, without a doubt. Same designer worked on many pieces of it. Certainly not as opulent. But. Okay, next slide. See if there's anything left. I don't know if there is. Whatever. They're just a lot of pieces. So I apologize. I really wanted to show a lot of information, but I just couldn't get a lot in here. And I have a tendency to want to show people what the building could look like, because we get stuck with what it looks like today, and I think that's sad that we look at it today and we don't really see what it could be, because this could be a symbol where you're driving down the road in Saugerties and you see the structure. This becomes emblematic of the success of this community. It could be that. And if it's not that, you know, I wrote in the paper the other day, I said, is it okay to have McDonald's be the most important structure on 9? I don't think it is.
The front is on the right? The front is on the right?
No, this is the front, sorry.
That's the corner there.
And actually, Michael brought a photograph I'd never seen before, in which gave us an idea that the deck actually the porch used to go all the way around the structure. The first time I've ever seen that. Okay, sorry, that's rambling on my part, I apologize.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Last but not least. Yes, Susan, right?
I came back to New York State in 1969 and came to Poughkeepsie. And at that time, they were in the process of stopping what was called urban renewal. Urban renewal was actually urban destruction. And I see here, in a sense, with the request for demolition, the same type of mentality of destroying something that is historic, that is part of the fabric of the society, and that once that is down, it's never going to be replaced. What is particularly encouraging for me tonight is to see that there are citizens here who don't have a vested financial interest and who are really speaking to you as the board, a review board, and urging you to think about this very carefully, that it is something that is very important to Saugerties.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, I have to say thank you for everyone for coming here tonight and for staying as late as you did. Thank you. It's kind of amazing. Don Snyder, thank you. What you've done for us is you've actually given us an opportunity to find out how much history there really is. And thank you, really. That's quite good. The whole idea that you've also helped us to make this process easier to follow and clear. And I hope you find that so. Now, I want to tell everyone that did blast this law that today the Historic Review Board accepted the petition from Mr. Scott Harrison to begin the process of designating his property the Carriage House, which is next door to Clovely. And the Historic Review Board on its own began the petitioning process to put Clovely, let's see, to say this correctly, to reaffirm the historic designation on Clovely. So what you're looking at today is you're looking at a concurrent series of meetings and public hearings. As we work through the process for the application for the demolition, we will be working through the process for the reaffirmed historic designation of Clovely. Just so you all know where we are, and truly, thank you for being here.
You're continuing the public hearing now? Is this the close of my demolition application public hearing?
Would you like it closed?
Yes.
Then we can officially close the public hearing for the demolition application.
And then, as you know, that will...
We're covering this.
That will then throw in the 5-day period, and you would then, within 5 days...
Yes, we do know that. Thank you. Yeah. Honestly, I learned so much doing this. It's good. So, folks, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for all your help this evening. You've made difficult decisions a little easier. Sorry, I should have looked at you when I said that. Excuse me. Folks at home, you're doing a great job. Keep paying attention.
They already had their meeting.